Hey, Teddy. Great to have you in this class, man. I'm looking forward to working through Romans together, hopefully enjoying some drinks and conversation around town as well. But here in week one, we're off to a good start. Thanks for your work. Thought I'd send you a reply video. I can never quite resign myself to just typing things. I always do that some, but not making the full transition to asynchronous online learning very well. I still feel like want to connect a little more. So anyway, hence the video. I think what you got here in engaging Paul's use of Habakkuk is some good probing. You probably noted that there's some difference between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. In the Septuagint, it's, at least in most manuscripts, it's explicit that the just one will live by the faith of God. Um, whereas it's more ambiguous in the Masoretic text. And of course, Paul doesn't make it explicit that it's the faith of God that's in view. So I tend to think that because this is a really programmatic statement of the letter, thesis statement, as I understand it, it is kind of pregnant with the layered argument that follows throughout the letter. So I don't think we have to interpret it too narrowly. It's okay here in the beginning if it's kind of evocative. That said, my own leaning is to understand what Paul says immediately before this in verse 17, that the justice of God or righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, and then he turns to Habakkuk as the kind of warrant for this claim, that he means the justice of God is revealed from the faith of God to the faith of the human. Um, that is kind of, I think, what is made more explicit in the Septuagint, even though Paul doesn't quote that version of the Septuagint that we have exactly. But I think what's clear in Habakkuk is that the faith of the just depends on the faith of God, that God will act in good faith. This is what informs the word of the Lord, that it is worthwhile to trust in God and therefore to live justly, to be just, in contrast to the faithless people that are oppressing Habakkuk's generation to his great horror, who are prideful, who are arrogant. I think you give a good description of the people um, with which the just are contrasted in Habakkuk. And that I think needs to at least be in the background as we make sense of what Paul is doing with faith, especially because faith is indeed a really important term in the first stage of the letter that unfolds directly from this thesis statement. Because uh, faith is, as Paul is going to present it, the alternative not to the proud and the arrogant as in Habakkuk, but the alternative to something very similar, which is people who are playing judge of one another, attempting to rule over each other rather than recognizing that God has exposed all of the human as unable to be judge, to rule over one another, and has, in doing that, you might say, empowered the human for the life that God has called the human to live by faith, not by authorizing some human beings to be the judges of others. So that's kind of the direction that it's going in Romans that I think spills out rather nicely from Paul's appeal to Habakkuk. The other thing I guess I'll add is there is some discussion, I think you might have mentioned this in the commentaries, about whether or not we should read Habakkuk messianically. And my sense is that we should allow Habakkuk to be open, we might say, to a messianic horizon. So I don't think that the hope or the faith that Habakkuk is commending is simply that, hang on tight while you're being raped, pillaged, and destroyed. The Messiah is coming one day. I don't think that's going to work, but I think that the faith that he enjoins, that is the faith of God that sort of inspires the faith of the human as its fruit, that reaches its fullness in the person of Jesus, in whom the faith of God and the faith of the human are one. And then in Romans, of course, this life of faith is spreading from the Messiah by the spirit of resurrection to all kinds of people, including these non-Jewish people that have been baptized into the Jewish Messiah that Paul is writing to in Rome. And this then becomes the basis for Paul to talk about their calling, like what faith looks like, what the obedience of faith, as he calls it, looks like for them. It looks like, as we see at the end of the letter, not judging one another, but sharing their table generously with each other, despite the different convictions and backgrounds and commitments that they bring to that common table. It means relating to even oppressive authorities without retaliating in like kind, protecting their conscience, leaving room for God's wrath. It means relating to one another as members of a shared body that depend on one another. It means in Romans 9-11 being patient with enemies that are in their community, enemies that are Paul's relatives, some of them. And so these are the ways that the obedience of faith is the life of the Messiah that is spreading to the audience. And I think that's a way to kind of see the development of Paul's thesis across the letter. In terms of what you've got here in the second response form, I mean, you know me, I love it when you recognize that something in the New Testament actually has deep and intricate roots in the Old Testament. And I think the righteousness of God is no exception. And it's important, I think, contrary to Luther. So this is where there's all kinds of Protestant debates about this stuff, but I don't think the righteousness of God, I think you mentioned this, is just a status. Instead, it does seem to me to be the activity of God, the presence of God that produces a human response that makes an impact on the earth. That's how the righteousness of God is disclosed, revealed. So you can see how in the context of Romans, the community that Paul's writing to is to be a witness to this active justice of God that is shaping their life together in the Messiah by the Spirit. So good observation about that. And I think what you say about salvation is interesting too, because I think there is a measure or a sense in which it is the work of God that is not always immediately known to people. People are experiencing salvation before they see what's happening to them in a whole variety of ways. And this letter is less about, here's what you have to do in order to be saved, and more about, here's what God has done to save. So that's a different kind of emphasis. And hopefully that kind of framing will throw some new light onto this controversial letter that has such a contested legacy. Thanks again, Teddy, for some good work. Glad to get the conversation started. If you want to reply to this video with questions, disagreement, whatever, it's always welcome. But if you don't, that's fine. If you could just write received or something like that so that I know that the video came through okay and that you're able to view it. Hope I'll be able to see you this Friday at our first in-person discussion for week 2 at 3 here on campus. And again, welcome to the course.